Okay. Welcome. 17 October, dis and dat information. We are dis and dat information. Anyway, later tonight, of course, there'll be after hours and night gallery and a bunch of other things. So I hope you'll stick around. It's the autonomouscollective.net. And we're finishing up finally with Saenz de Sicilia's Subsumption, the concluding chapter of his text Subsumption in Kant, Hegel, and Marx, From the Critique of Reason to the Critique of Society by Andres Saenz de Sicilia. We've gone through some pretty interesting ideas, some of which are complicated or need to be unpacked, as they say, which means I have to read the whole damn thing again, not over YouTube, but that I am going to read it over again because there's a lot to do. All kinds of things are suggested. So, the conclusion. The three engagements with the problem of subsumption from which this book departs all share the same critical impulse, that is, to register the mediated structure of an apparently immediate presence or objective reality, and to explore the relations and processes by which that mediation occurs as a subsumption of diverse elements under a universal order or set of principles. I know that's really complicated. There's a lot there, but um, it makes sense in the sense in that you have a, and with all due respect to the concept of articulation, this idea that multiple mediations are necessary, that subsumption is a way of talking about that. It helps to explain it in more concrete detail what's going on with the question of, for example, labor and labor power. And if I know this may not seem important to you, but it gave me a lot of clarity about the difference between um, labor and labor power. Not that I didn't know what it was, but that this provides an additional way in which we can think about this, and to think about it as a kind of set of surfaces or layers will be useful for my own work. Anyway, in every case, this involves rejecting the classical view that subsumption has a merely logical content and validity, that it is an empty or formal category. Instead, a critical approach to subsumption uncovers the synthetic basis of the logical identity it lays claim to in the tautological relation between universal and particular. See, we're still in the Hegelian thing there, right? It lays claim to in the tautological relation between universal. What is revealed in each case is that productive relations and processes play a decisive form determining role whose significance is not locally limited to the individual elements that are subsumed, but also underpin the global consistency and unity of the systematic totality within which they occur, thus mediating the constitutive relation between discrete forms, mechanisms of formation, and the compositional totality within which they are all inscribed. So I know that may seem a little confusing, but you can sort of think of it, as these sort of spherical sets of one kind or another that help us work through sort of categorical problems. Wherever heterogeneous elements and orders are brought into relate it try this again. Wherever heterogeneous elements and orders are brought into relation subsumptively, these underlying processes of schematization, synthesis, and ordering are always required to produce the logical identity and systemic coherence implied in that relation. We can thus reconstruct the parallel methodological strategies that allowed Kant to uncover a, quote, art concealed in the depths of the soul, unquote. Hegel to trace the, quote unquote, labor of the negative, and Marx to descend into the, quote, hidden abode of production. All of these in search of the dynamic, active processes and relations that generate the coherence and objectivity of the apparent by subjecting diverse elements to universal principles of adaptation, correlation, and transformation. In each case, however, simply identifying the discrete processes of unification and form determination as the action of some universal upon a set of particulars proves to be insufficient, because the very possibility of this formative relation lies in a structurally over-determining context within which the subsumed and subsuming elements or orders are both inscribed. So there's this weird reciprocity going on, or inclusion or union, as it were. So despite their heterogeneity, the multiple orders of being must coexist in a shared medium whose structural unity governs the specific relations of production pertaining to those subsumption acts, ACTS, through which individual elements are formed according to a global order. At the same time, the subsumptive processes themselves are shown to underpin the actuality of that global medium, the totality of composition. There is thus a reciprocal determination between the processes of subsumption and the systemic structure in which they take place, with each grounding the possibility of the other. This idea of grounding, the possibility of the other is a really important notion. At the core of the critical concept of subsumption, then, the two interlocking processes. Number one, the specific acts of form determination that give conceptual unity and determinacy to a range of diverse particulars according to a universal order or system of principles. Number two, the second interlocking process, the ordination and unification of those subsumptive processes and their results within a structured compositional totality that is the ground of their possibility, but at the same time constituted only in and through them. This is the underlying idea that subsumption describes, this kind of dynamic movement between elements, and they're not discrete elements, they're all kind of mixed together, synthesized in that way. Now, if this is the shared framework through which Kant, Hegel, and Marx all employ subsumption as a critical concept, they nonetheless differ in how the structure and effects of the relation between these two levels of processes are to be conceived. For Kant, subsumption is grounded in a structure of reflexive closure, that is, transcendental subjectivity, which acts as a fixed structure of unity devoid of development, within which both concepts and intuitions are composed. And it is precisely by virtue of this common ground that they can be related subsumptively in a quote unquote mechanical manner. That's Kant. For Hegel, subsumption is posited as both a moment and immanent function of a totality in its dialectical development, which means that the reflexive closure of Kantian apperception has been transformed into the processual concept of a subject with distinct stages whose relational structure is transformed as it overcomes its own contradictions. There's a lot there. Here, the compositional totality is no longer indifferent to the determinate empirical content produced within it, but only exists in and as the unity of this content with its conceptual form. A unity which expresses itself in various structured configurations of reciprocity. So, maybe it looks like Brownian motion, or maybe it looks like pinball machine. Um, a lot going on. Let's put it that way. This also indicates a transition from a parallel series of universals, a synchronically fixed set of pure concepts, to a serial sequence of subjective structures that are imminently connected in their diachronic development, each one giving rise to and dissolving into the next. This is this is an important description of how this is operating. It is in the course of this developmental process that Hegel decouples the compositional totality grounding form and its systematic function. Oh, sorry. Grounding form and its systemic function from the finite standpoint of an isolated consciousness and generates an intersubjective and ultimately social relational theory of composition and subsumption. We saw how he sort of did that move to make it to move from the Hegel to Marx. This theory then opens the possibility of thinking the fluid, changing relation between form and totality, while at the same time enclosing that relation within a speculatively totalized developmental series from whose standpoint subsumptive relations are registered as partial and inadequately developed, mired in the stasis of a posited unity of elements whose opposition has not been sublated. Marx is the first thinker to break, if inconsistently, with the idealist closure of subsumption and composition, which are in his writings no longer modeled on a purely reproductive structure of self-same reciprocity, as with Kantian apperception, nor in the developmental structure of a self-perfecting ideal subject, as with Hegel's concept. By dialectically mediating systemic reproduction and development through one another in his materialism of the social reproduction process. Let me start that again. By dialectically mediating systemic reproduction and development through one another in his materialism of the social reproduction process, Marx refuses to ascribe a self-identical unity to the compositional process as a whole that would impose synchronic or diachronic closure upon it. Instead, this process can be seen to be characterized by a radical openness at the level of history and disjunction at the level of structure that was lacking in either Kant or Hegel's ideally circumscribed totalities. There's a lot there. Now let me break for a second, and is what kind of improvement is this? Is this an improvement? And in fact, I think you could say, in terms of history or kind of diachronic, sort of move, it is. There is still, back to the text, there is still an essential reciprocity here between acts of subsumptive form determination and the systemic structure which grounds them. But for Marx, this is a dynamic, changing, and unstable reciprocity, which cannot be fully captured at the level of a universal or ahistorical theoretical discourse. Such a discourse can merely register the constraints within which this reciprocity takes place by stipulating that social reality necessarily occurs as a practical process of production and consumption, i.e., reproduction. The concept of subsumption is in this way connected to a logic and immanent dynamic of social forms and the metabolic synthesis underlying their actuality. That is to quote unquote natural history, natural-history, without reducing them to an ideal schema of totality or development. Marx's key modification of the critical concept of subsumption therefore comes with his dislocation of the subject of composition, that is that which produces or determines form, and the composed or compositional, composed/compositional totality, that is the sphere in which form has its reality and basis, and in which its formation proceeds. So it's important to focus on this idea that there is a kind of dysfunction between the two things. This dislocation means that whilst each is always conditioned by and constituted through the other, their correlation can nonetheless only be grasped in a multitude of diverse historical modes rather than essentially, according to an immutable order of being from which both the particular and the universal would derive their specific characteristics and systemic function, as with Kant and Hegel. Marx's theory of the subsumption of labor under capital is the result of concretizing this historically open theory of social form determination and structural reciprocity as subsumption under relations of production, with reference to their specifically capitalist articulation. Now, despite the partial repression of this theory resulting from the provisional closure of the book Capital, its reconstruction is of central significance to a critical social theory today, insofar as it allows us to think through the problem of capitalist power exactly at the points of integration as well as resistance to it, through which the being, activity, and reproduction of living labor is determined as an aspect of capital's life process, life-process. By reflecting critically on these moments and processes of integration/transcendence, as well as their specific forms and contradictions, this perspective avoids the theoretical functionalism that would either reduce labor's concrete agency to an already internal or secondary aspect of capital's dialectical totality, or asserts labor's absolute ontological independence as a vital reserve of pure potentiality which has simply been captured by an apparatus of capitalist command. Instead, subsumption is the key category of mediation through which the volatile and contested nature of the social process and the struggles to determine its specific and general forms of existence can be grasped. This is something Echeverria noted in the mid-1980s. Quote, "The concept of subsumption has a special importance with respect to the core of Marx's critical discourse. That is to say, the theory of the contradiction between the socio-natural process of production/consumption and the socio-capitalist process of the valorization of value. It is the most advanced attempt made by Marx to show in general theoretical terms the way in which those two contradictory processes are articulated." Footnote 1. So, if we take the social reproduction process to be the compositional totality through which this contestation is played out and the site where its effects are felt, we find that this subsumptive articulation is operative at three core levels, in which the opposition between value, big V value, and use value, value and use value, adopts distinct moments of presence or different figures. Footnote 2. In each moment The opposition is suspended or repressed subsumptively, marking a threshold of integration/transcendence, a development of the contradiction into a deeper form, which is to say, a form that affects more fundamentally the social reproduction process as a whole. Number one, firstly, there is a subsumption of wealth in its natural form as practical objects or use values to the generalized commodity exchange and money relations that allows it to enter into economic relation with capital and actualizes the value form of that wealth as a specifically capitalist dimension of social objectivity. Slot there. Here, the contradiction is manifested in the opposition between use value and exchange value internal to the commodity and the subsumption of the former, that is use value, under the latter, that is exchange value, that occurs within the sphere of circulation. Through commodification, capital and labor are posited as relatable and commensurable, even as mutually presupposing one another within the compositional totality of bourgeois commercial society. This is a formal argument, and it could be well, anyway, back to the text. Central to this process is the formal determination of living labor in the value form of the labor power commodity, which presupposes historical and ongoing forms of so-called primitive accumulation, as well as the generalization of a legal apparatus of property relations and state powers that together constitute a field of economic signification within which the spectral objectivity of value is constituted as actual. It is this extra economic production and maintenance of economic relations that generates the conditions for labor's subsumption in production. The separation of productive subjects from both one another and the practical object of their labor, that is, the means of production, along with their subsequent rearticulation as a result of commodity exchange. Number two, secondly, there is a subsumption of labor qua activity under capital qua self-valorizing value, which occurs via the management and exploitation of the former in the sphere of production. Here, once the sale and purchase of labor power has taken place, the contradictions of the sphere of exchange are suspended, and a new set of contradiction emerges in the opposition between the labor process and the valorization process. The conflict over labor's integration and transcendence in production is primarily expressed in the application of capitalist command, designed to ensure that labor, in addition to creating use values, also pumps out surplus value that capital can appropriate. This occurs, A, in the form of direct interpersonal supervision, what Marx termed formal subsumption, and B, through the technical recomposition of the labor process such that it valorizes capital with an ever greater efficiency and certainty, what Marx termed real subsumption, as well as C, the use of hybrid forms in which direct capitalist command is absent, but labor nonetheless produces surplus value for capital via alternative forms of economic exploitation. It's a lot there. A, the form of direct interpersonal supervision. B, the technical recomposition of the labor process. And C, the use of hybrid forms. Okay, so that was number two. Number three, thirdly, there is a subsumption of the great total process of social reproduction under the movement of expanded reproduction proper to total social capital. This occurs as a mediated effect arising from the distinctive capitalist synthesis of number one above and number two, through which society itself, grasped as a practical compositional totality, comes to be objectively and subjectively form determined by capital as the aggregate result of the activity of a multitude of competing private producers. There's a lot there. But whilst capital subsumption is here operative on a social scale, which we just looked at, it is neither final nor complete, nor does it simply represent a quantitative extension of the same basic processes found in above number 1 and number 2. Rather, new contradictions and forms of mediation emerge at this totalized level. For example, consumption, political institutions, the cultural sphere, etc. Thus, generating a dynamic of subsumption, connecting and coordinating the specific instances of form determination and circulation and production. The subsumption of reproduction under accumulation is not direct, but mediated through this dynamic, which expresses the openness and conflict-ridden opposition between the life process of social individuals and the life process of capital. So there's a lot there in these three things, but this is the nub, you know. Anyway, back to the text. The key to understanding the full subsumption of labor under capital then lies in grasping the ways in which it is, number 1, commodified, rendering it a formally exchangeable good subject to economic circulation and purchase by capital. Then, number 2, how it is that capital commands and transforms the labor process in order to make it also function materially as a valorization process, rendering it productive, forming, Marx says, of surplus value. The conjunction of these two different acts, 1 and 2, finally affects 3, a subsumption of labor's life process as such, that is, as a socially reproductive totality, under capital as a self-expanding economic totality. There's a lot there. These 3 moments of subsumption outline the process of values autonomization from a form of economic mediation and of social objectivity to autonomization from a form of economic mediation and of social objectivity to a medium of exploitation and domination, to the automatic subject of the social process that progressively negates human autonomy and the basic politicity of self-definition proper to the reproduction process. The reality of capital's real abstractions is thus not reducible to a discrete moment or act. That is, exchange, an exchange action, as it is for Adorno and Sohn-Rethel, but it is distributed across the entirety of the reproduction process in a series of different forms and through a number of distinct but interconnected processes. Each level of subsumption involves the functional form determination of an aspect of labor by capital, that is, functional determination within the circulation process, functional determination within the production process, functional determination within the reproduction process. Of these levels, it is number 2 that really constitutes the heart of capitalist domination as the moment in which social individuals are directly subordinated and the constituting transformative powers of human practice are compelled to serve the end of capital. Functionally determined as productive of surplus value. But all 3, as described above, are by necessity co-implicated in the capitalist social relations. But number 1 and number 3 are simultaneously both conditions and effects of the essential process of exploitation that occurs in number 2, around which all other moments of the social process are structured and revolve. This is going to take a lot of work. I've grasped as a dynamic, this active reciprocity between the conditions affects and compositional totality must all be thought together such that, for example, direct forms of subordination in production are imminently connected to forms of subjectification occurring through consumption, culture, law, education, etc. If this expansion complicates our understanding of capitalist subsumption by following the network of relations through which its realization interpenetrates with the actions of states, the working class, in both its reproduction and its obstinate but elastic presence within the production processes and other non-economic forces, that is, surplus populations, non-state actors, nature itself, it nonetheless does so in a way that brings the theory of subsumption closer to the overarching problem that circumscribes every Marxist theoretical engagement, that of the revolutionary transformation of social conditions. The dynamism of this theory allows a recognition of the central role played by mechanisms of subsumption within the logic of the body politic in capitalist society, without, however, reducing its presence to an ideal or unilateral schema that would foreclose or guarantee the possibility of historical rupture. MAGA. However, that openness is dependent upon adopting a critical stance that is not purely systemic or capital-centric, all you yuppies, but instead works deconstructively in and against the apparent unity and coherence of the bourgeois system in order to reveal and interrogate the conflictual processes underlying labor subsumption. If we refuse theoretical closure, yeah, then this deconstruction cannot simply aim to grasp an objective totality of relations determining the final truth of social experience in either the mode of a Kantian apperception or Hegelian Erinnerung, as Max Tombs argues, T-O-M-B-S, Max Tumba argues, quote, it is not a case of giving merely an objective representation of the processes currently underway. We have to understand the subjective insurgencies that disarticulate the process because the political task is to rearticulate them on new foundations. Close quote, footnote 3. It should be noted that this does not imply adopting the quote-unquote standpoint of labor or working class as the historical subject, as Pastone is criticized, nor does it mean adopting the unmediated standpoint of a politicized field of singularities, as Adorno, Negri, and Deleuze do in diverse ways, all of which advocate novel, but ultimately hollow, pull your punches, hollow theoretical categories of relations, that is, affinity, rhizome, R-H-I-Z-O-M-E, etc., as if emancipation depended on balancing concepts. It rather means taking the standpoint of the contradiction, synthesis, and antagonism subsisting within the logical identity of universal and particular, of departing from the real conflicts that delimit the actuality and possibilities of form in order to both comprehend and practically overcome them. The point of this critical endeavor, then, is not to simply to complete or refine Marx's system with a missing theory of subsumption. Marxist thought is partial in many respects, and whichever stance one takes with respect to his planned work, the 6 volumes, blah, 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 the point would not be for us to fill in the blanks, but rather to extend, apply, and rework his insights in relation to the situation within which we find ourselves. And in that way, sustain the status of Marxism as revolutionary discourse, because the critical concept of subsumption points beyond the completeness and coherency of a closed totality, identifying instead the points of tension and antagonism between heterogeneous levels or orders of actuality, it opens up systemic discourse to real conditions and their contradictory character. Now, this insight allows us to reconnect the critical deconstructive moment, that is, critical deconstructive moment of Marx's discourse. The detour of theory that pierces through surface appearances of social phenomena and their cohesion with the materialist impulse to situate knowledge in the force field of real conditions as a practical response to the demands, needs, and limits of those conditions. The crystallization of thought in a moment of danger. Footnote 4. The theory of subsumption thus situates itself at the multiple points of tension at which the conflict over integration and transcendence is played out between capital and labor, thus connecting the action of theoretical critique to a revolutionary horizon by focusing on how the inner logic of capitalist accumulation is articulated with the social life process as a permanently unstable and generative process of domination. The combination of systemic and anti-systemic impulses contained in this dynamic approach affirms the following methodological insight of Yanis Banerjee. In the dialectical method of development, the movement from abstract to concrete is not a straight line process. One returns to the concrete at expanded levels of the total curve, reconstructing the surface of society by stages as a structure of several dimensions. And this implies finally that in Marx's Capital, the text, we shall find a continuous oscillation between essence and appearance. Yet, there is a point at which this movement, the very development of the concept of capital, breaks down in the text Capital as we have it today. There is a point at which the form of enquiry, E-N-Q-U-I-R-Y, the form of enquiry, is no longer reflected back to us in the dialectically perfected shape of a method of presentation. To say this is only to say that Marx's book, Capital, remains incomplete as a reproduction of the concrete in thought. Close quote. Footnote 5. Most importantly, the theory insists that the presentation of a revolutionary theory cannot be determined without reference to the global composition of social practices and subjectivities, and in doing so, remains rigorously materialist in orientation. Unlike enclosed idealist totalities where actuality and concreteness can be theoretically determined according to systemic place and function, here the concrete has its axial point. Now, is it an axial point or an axiological point? But anyway, its axial point in the practical context of struggle that synthesizes the already constituted amalgam of congealed historical forms with those to be constituted, 2-be-constituted, and therefore necessarily multiple and fragmented, or in-constitution, and therefore necessarily ambivalent within an open process of reproduction development. The center of gravity of the dynamic Darstellung emanates from this process, measuring the actuality of form by its adequation, adequation, adequation to the revolutionary movement it supports. In this sense, the function of critique would be to deconstruct the surface forms of capitalist society in order to bring the essential constituting practice of agents into conscious interconnection with their understanding of, and therefore action within that society. This is the revolutionary horizon of Marx's critique and the theory of subsumption contained within it. Yet this is not a purely negative or demystifying procedure. In the course of the critique, positive conceptual knowledge is generated in its real connection with social practices. Subsumption is thus at this further level of concretion situated at the interstitial, interstitial, interstitial point of negative critical knowledge and positive critical knowledge. Negative in relation to the economic categories in which oppression appears in distorted forms as market fate, and positive critical knowledge in relation to the real processes of practical activity and interconnection through which society reproduces itself. Yet, even when conceived dynamically, a theory of subsumption at the level of generality it has been presented here cannot replace the more concrete engagements needed to grasp these specific articulations. All it can do is support such engagements by mediating the systematic discourse with a historical one in order to negate closure and thus orient the knowledge of general laws toward real conflicts. The theory of subsumption is not simply a pillar within an expanded Marxist system, but a framework for further critical research and engagement. Many more questions and problems remain open and in need of development on the basis of this dynamic. For example, in what way can we rethink the relationship between individuality and subjectivity in light of historical and spatial developments in the configuration of capitalist subsumption? The paucity of Marx's comments on the state leaves a huge field of inquiry that Marxist theory has only partially broached, one that is key for grasping the conditions under which this dynamic is unfolding, both at a national level and differentially in the relations between and across polities. If the challenge for critical social theory is not to advance toward systematic completeness, but to reinforce its historical relevance and operability, then the production of new questions and problems such as these will be a positive rather than negative symptom. Okay, there's a shitload there. And let me say that just to talk about my own work, I've got to read Banerjee and Echeverria and a bunch of other folks to get a better sense of this. But let me offer up that uh, what Saenz to Sicilia does in this final chapter is really try to put the whole damn thing together, define all the different elements. At some moment, I mean, if I were teaching with this text, for example, I would actually put the conclusion first, and then we would sort of pick it apart and then go through the text because he does explain all of this. And what he's done is he's schematized it in a pretty useful way. So that would be my sort of final comment on this. And let me say that I know this is it sounds confusing to you perhaps, because it does have all of these quote unquote continental philosophy terms that are problematic for people who are more used to other kinds of terms. Totality has a different sense, and deconstruction is not exactly what you think it might be. Much like subsumption having those kind of multiple kinds of meanings. But let me just say that this explains a whole bunch of different things simultaneously. And with respect to empirical work, is actually quite useful. I mean, for me anyway. But your mileage may vary. Let me say that I am going to go back over this, and I have to read Echeverria and et cetera, Tomba, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll probably do that and then come back through, and I might even review this darn thing, even though I don't like doing reviews, if only to sort of set in place certain questions that I have certainly within the context of the text. in terms of, for example, mediation, the relation to Lukács. Um, um, Certain other folks are, sort of not present in the text or only hinted at, and yet, because he makes a swipe, for example, at Deleuze, et cetera, and I understand what he's trying to do, but you can't just sort of, not that he writes it off, but he says it's a little too far out there. I would assert that it isn't, and that ultimately, when you look at Negri, et cetera, that you don't have to, it's not going too far. It's just simply taking a slightly different, as he says, articulation. But anyway, so that's my sense of the text. And as I said yesterday, we got to the end early, and there's no one here now to yell at me. So I will stop the live stream.